The server asked him to leave. "We can't have people begging here," she snapped. The man in the wheelchair said nothing, just slowly turned to roll out, carrying a folded letter on his lap. No one read it. No one cared. The rain outside didn't stop. It only made the silence inside the cafe feel colder. He reached the door on his own, struggling against its weight, then disappeared onto the sidewalk unnoticed, unwanted. But 30 minutes later, everything changed. A cluster of armored vehicles blocked the road. Secret Service agents leapt out with the precision of a presidential threat protocol. Customers stood up in confusion. A barista dropped a cup. And then the door burst open again, not with anger, but desperation. A woman in a tailored navy suit, her face pale, stormed inside. Behind her, aides scrambled to keep up. "Where is he?" she demanded. "Where is he now?" The server blinked. "Who?" she stammered. "The man in the wheelchair." And then, through the wet glass, she saw him. Still there. Sitting in the rain, soaked to the bone, hands in his lap. The senator rushed out without a word. And when she reached him, she dropped to one knee and cried. If you believe true heroes don't demand attention, they earn it quietly. Type respect in the comments, hit like, and subscribe to hear stories that restore dignity. He came in every Thursday. Same time, same jacket, same careful wheels. The locals called him Rick, but no one knew much more than that. His wheelchair was scratched along the sides, patched in places with black tape. His coat, military green, standard issue, hung loose on his frame, shoulders sagging but posture upright. He never asked for anything. Just a coffee. Black. 1 sugar. He'd sit near the window, rain or shine, and place a folded letter on the table like it was part of the order. Sometimes he'd stare at it. Sometimes he'd just sit with closed eyes, listening to the low hum of the cafe's chatter. The young barista with purple hair had once asked if the letter was important. He'd only smiled. You could say that. Rick's hands trembled slightly when he lifted his cup. Not from age, he wasn't as old as people assumed. It was something else. Residual tension. Like his body still remembered things his mind refused to revisit. His eyes, pale blue and distant, watched people come and go. Kids threw tantrums. Couples argued. Phones buzzed and clicked. Rick simply observed. Not judging. Not reacting. As if he'd lived through worse noise than 1,000 coffee shops could produce. He wore a patch on his right sleeve. It had faded into near invisibility, but to the trained eye, the outline of a combat medic cross was still visible. The manager had once asked him not to park his wheelchair near the aisle. It disrupts the walk path, she'd said. He had nodded, moved back 3 feet, and said, better, with no trace of sarcasm. That's the thing about men like Rick. They don't push back. Not loudly. They just keep showing up, quietly. Until the world decides to notice. Rick wasn't there for charity. Or sympathy. He wasn't even there for the coffee, if truth be told. He came for something simpler, something quieter, a chance. Each week, he folded and unfolded the same letter. Not a resume. Not a legal form. A letter addressed in tight, clean print. Senator Grace Halvorson. Washington, D.C. office. Incident September 13, 03. No one ever asked about it. Not even the postal clerks where he'd tried to send it. The first 3 times, the letter had been returned. Unable to forward, they'd said. A 4th time, he tried hand delivery at a local rally, but security hadn't let him near. Now, he sat in the cafe across from the senator's hotel, waiting. Hoping. Because he'd heard she was in town for a fundraiser, for a speech, for something. He didn't care what. Only that she might walk in. The letter wasn't angry. Wasn't accusatory. It was a testimony. A record of something that happened in the desert, 22 years ago. Something the world forgot. Rick had written it by hand, each line precise. He'd rewritten it 12 times until the words sounded less like grief and more like truth. All he wanted was for her to see it. To remember. To acknowledge what had been buried. It wasn't about medals. Or blame. Or justice. It was about a boy named Eli, and a girl in uniform, and one impossible choice. Rick didn't need the world to understand. He just needed her to. That morning, the air was thick with humidity and impatience. The cafe was busier than usual. Locals murmured about the senator's visit, her security detail, the media trucks 2 blocks away. Rick wheeled in unnoticed, as always. But this time, something was different. A new shift manager, blonde, tight-lipped, clearly stressed, looked up as he entered. She stiffened. "Sir, do you have an order?" Rick gestured to the counter. "Just a coffee." She eyed his tattered jacket, the worn wheels of his chair, the letter in his hand. "You can't sit here without ordering first. We've had problems with loitering." Rick nodded slowly. "Of course." He moved forward. The line wasn't long, but the stairs were. A teenager snickered. Someone muttered, "Here we go again." When he reached the front, the manager leaned toward the barista. "If he causes trouble, call security." Rick heard it. Said nothing. Paid in quarters and faded bills. Took his coffee, wheeled toward the window, same spot as always. But today, the manager followed. "I'm sorry," she said coldly, "but we're asking people not to take up space during peak hours. Especially if they're not actively eating." Rick blinked. "I haven't touched my coffee." She glanced at the folded letter. "Sir, you're making customers uncomfortable. If this is some kind of protest, please leave." Around him, no one spoke. No one objected. Rick looked down at the letter in his lap, then back up. His voice didn't tremble. "It's not a protest. It's a message." She crossed her arms. "Not here, it's not." And just like that, after 12 years of Thursdays, he was pushed out. The rain had started as a whisper, soft, misty, barely a drizzle. But by the time Rick reached the curb, it had settled into a steady rhythm. Each droplet tapping the fabric of his jacket like a ticking clock. He wheeled himself to the edge of the cafe awning and stopped. No one came after him. No one called him back. He sat there, alone, in the rain, watching steam curl from his untouched coffee. The letter stayed dry only because he clutched it under his coat, pressed close to his chest. Across the street, black SUVs formed a perimeter around the hotel entrance. A man in a dark suit spoke into an earpiece, nodded, and opened a side door. A few flashes popped from nearby cameras. The senator had arrived. Rick didn't move. Not yet. His wheels were slick with rain. His fingers, cold. Back inside the cafe, the manager was busy wiping down a counter that didn't need cleaning. The barista glanced toward the window, her eyes softened, but she said nothing. 2 children pressed their noses to the glass. "Mommy, why is that man just sitting there?" "Don't look," their mother replied. Rick heard that. Not because it was loud, because he'd heard it before. In different forms. Different places. Don't look. Don't ask. Don't remember. He inhaled deeply. His lungs filled with cold air and memory. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out the letter. Unfolded it. Looked at the signature at the bottom. His own. And beside it, the name of the woman who once bled beside him in the sand. Lieutenant Grace Halvorson. He whispered to no one, "You owe him this." And he waited. Inside the hotel, Senator Grace Halvorson was finalizing remarks for a veteran scholarship fund. The press was waiting. Staff were buzzing. Her aide leaned in, whispering, "You're due downstairs in 5, ma'am." Grace nodded absently, her fingers pausing over a page. Something had pulled her gaze toward the window. A shadow. A silhouette. She stepped closer. The rain distorted the glass, but she saw him. An older man in a wheelchair. Soaked. Unmoving. It shouldn't have meant anything. She saw people like him every day outside events, waiting for assistance, for help, for recognition. Most were strangers. But something about him wasn't. She pressed her palm to the glass. Her breath caught. "Wait," she whispered. "Is that?" She turned to her security detail. "Find out who that is. Now." Seconds later, an aide returned, breathless. He was just removed from the cafe across the street. Something about loitering. Grace's heart kicked against her chest. "Describe him." "Military jacket. Wheelchair. Letter in his lap." Her world stopped. The air thinned. "Letter," she repeated. "Was his name Rick?" The aide blinked. I don't know." Grace didn't wait. She grabbed her coat and strode toward the door. Secret Service scrambled to follow. "Ma'am, your speech." "Delay it," she barked. "If that's who I think it is, then I'm already 20 years too late." The motorcade fired up. 4 black SUVs moved as one, cutting across the street. Inside the cafe, the server paled as uniformed agents flooded the sidewalk. Cameras rolled. Pedestrians froze. And Grace, U.S. Senator, decorated officer, media figure, ran into the storm like she was back in a war zone. To find the man who once saved her life. And whose name she hadn't said aloud since the day he disappeared into the smoke. Rick didn't look up when the vehicles arrived. Didn't flinch when boots hit pavement. He simply kept his eyes on the letter in his lap, now soaked despite his efforts. Rain streaked the page, bleeding the ink. But the name was still visible. Lieutenant Halvorsen. And then he heard the voice. "Rick?" He looked up. Slowly. As if memory needed a moment to catch up to reality. There she was. Standing in the rain, without an umbrella, without a speech, without cameras, just her. No rank on her collar now. Just panic in her eyes. "Rick," she breathed again, stepping closer, kneeling without hesitation. "Oh my God. You're alive." He blinked. "Been trying to tell you that for 12 years. She let out a broken laugh. Then she saw the letter. Her breath caught. "You kept it?" "I rewrote it," he said softly. "A dozen times. Couldn't find the right words to say thank you, or ask why no one ever came back." She took the letter in trembling hands, shielding it with her coat. "I looked for you. After the evac, they told me you didn't make it." Rick gave a weak smile. Turns out they were wrong. Around them, people watched. Inside the cafe, the server who'd kicked him out stood frozen, jaw slack. A news crew began filming. The world had turned its eyes on something real for once. Grace didn't care. She squeezed Rick's hand. "You saved me. You saved all of us. And I let the world forget you." Rick's voice cracked. "All I ever wanted was for Eli's name to be remembered." She nodded. "Then let's remember him. Together." And right there, in the pouring rain, a senator wept beside a man the country had erased and started the first step toward making it right. They moved him inside, not out of pity, but out of something heavier. Reverence. But Rick looked smaller beneath the cafe lights than he had out in the rain. His coat dripped onto the tile. The wheels of his chair squeaked faintly with each turn. Grace sat beside him, still clutching the letter like it held oxygen. Her aides tried to speak, but she raised a hand, "Not now." She glanced up at the server who'd pushed him out earlier. The woman paled, her eyes flicking from Rick's trembling hands to the senator's tear-lined cheeks. "Do you know who he is?" Grace asked, her voice barely controlled. "He carried 3 wounded from a burning Humvee outside Al-Hakam. Under fire. With a broken femur. He wouldn't leave without the last one. That one was me." The server stammered, I didn't know." No, Grace interrupted, her voice hardening. You didn't care. The room was quiet. The air was thicker than the storm outside. Rick leaned forward slightly, his voice hoarse. It's not about me. It's about the ones who didn't come back. Eli. Dixon. Marquez. Grace nodded, her hands clenched. They're not on any memorial. Their deaths were classified. Operation Gorgon was buried. Exactly, Rick said. And I've spent 20 years being erased with them. Silence again. Even the customers in the cafe had stopped pretending to sip coffee. Then Rick's breath hitched. He coughed hard, deep, the sound raw. Grace reached for him. Rick? He waved her off. It's fine. Old lungs. Spent too much time breathing sand. But Grace saw the truth. He was weakening. Fast. And she realized something terrifying. She might have found him just in time to lose him forever. By evening, word had spread. Not through press releases, not through social media, but through people. Real people who had seen something real. The video of Senator Halvorsen kneeling beside a man in a wheelchair was already making rounds online. But what gripped hearts wasn't her title, it was her face. Raw. Broken. Reverent. By the next morning, #RememberEli and #Operation Gorgon were trending. Veterans from across the country began sharing stories, fragments of memory, old photos never meant for public view. But Rick didn't care about trends. He cared about truth. Grace sat beside him in a private hospital room now. The VA had expedited his transfer under her authority. But Rick's body was giving out. His lungs, his legs, his heart, too many years of being forgotten. She stayed the night. Read him old letters. Played a voicemail from one of Eli's surviving brothers. Tell him I remember the name Briggs. My mom used to pray for that man. Every night. Every night. Rick smiled faintly. That kid had a good voice. Could have been a singer. You saved him too, Grace whispered. I just didn't want another flag folded. Grace stood, walking to the window, trying to keep her voice steady. I've already sent in the papers. The declassification process. A full Senate resolution. I want names on the wall, Rick. Including yours. He chuckled, breath shallow. Don't put me on a wall. Just a bench. Somewhere with sun. She turned. Her eyes wet. Deal. Then Rick looked up, eyes sharp for a final moment. Make them know, he said. Not for me. For Eli. And Grace understood. This wasn't a reunion. It was a mission. 2 weeks later, a ceremony was held on the Capitol lawn. No news helicopters were allowed. No campaign banners. No fundraising speeches. Just names. 3 of them. Carved freshly into black granite. Private Eli Warner. Specialist Rosa Marquez. Corporal Marcus Dixon. At the base of the stone sat a small bronze plaque. Operation Gorgon, once classified. Never forgotten. Rick wasn't there in person. He couldn't be. The infection had spread to his lungs. The doctors warned Grace gently that time was narrowing. But the ceremony was streamed to a quiet hospital room in Virginia. Rick watched from his bed, propped up with care, a clean shirt buttoned high to his neck. He didn't cry. Not until Grace stepped forward on the broadcast. She wore no uniform, no medal. Just a white blouse and a ribbon on her chest, Eli's ribbon, identical to the one found in his kit after his death. She spoke only 37 words. They were called ghosts. Lost to silence. But silence can't erase sacrifice. We honor them today not because they were perfect, but because they showed up when it mattered most. Rick's hand trembled slightly. Not from weakness, but from peace. He turned to the nurse beside him. "Can I get that bench now?" he smiled. And for the first time in years, the nurse didn't see a patient. She saw a soldier. A month later, a new bench was installed outside the rebuilt cafe. The owner had changed. The staff, too. The place was renamed the Eli and Briggs Cafe. Not flashy. Not political. Just real. On the back of the bench, etched in simple serif font. For those who waited. And never gave up. Grace returned once a year, quietly. She never brought cameras. She'd sit on the bench, coffee in hand, and say nothing for 20 minutes. Locals learned not to interrupt. Some placed flowers. Others just nodded. Veterans came, too. One by one. They left notes, patches, sometimes dog tags. A Gold Star mother once sat in silence and left behind a photograph wrapped in cloth. One afternoon, a boy no older than 10 asked his father, "Who was Rick?" The father, a former medic himself, replied, "Someone who didn't wait to be thanked to do the right thing." The boy looked thoughtful. Then saluted. Inside the cafe, a laminated copy of Rick's letter sat framed on the wall. Above it, a quote from Grace herself. "Dignity doesn't raise its voice. But when you hear it, you never forget it." Rick Briggs passed quietly in his sleep 3 weeks after the bench was installed. There was no official funeral. No national anthem. But word spread. And on the morning of his burial, people came. Veterans in uniform. A schoolteacher from Illinois who'd taught Eli Warner. A senator. A janitor from the VA. A nurse. A baker. A Boy Scout. No speeches. Just silence, the kind that says everything. A folded flag rested against his casket. Not because of his rank. But because someone remembered. That afternoon, Grace returned to the cafe. Sat on the bench. Placed one hand on the cool metal. And smiled. He waited, she whispered. And in the end, the country came to him. That night, the cafe held its first open mic tribute. One by one, people read stories of veterans who never made the news. Rick was the first. But not the last.